So today we'll be talking about chapter 1, and it's called The First Civilizations. We'll be talking about the peoples of Western Asia and North Africa in particular, because this map you're looking at is a migration map, and it shows the oldest human migrations around 200,000 years ago coming out of Africa and then spreading around into more recent years. And the most recent years on the map here are around the furthest northern part of the northern hemisphere, when nomadic peoples were crossing the Bering Strait into North America. First, I'd like to give a brief overview of the evolution of man. The first hominid meaning those who walk upright, were called the Australopithecines. And these Australopithecines have been carbon dated at 3 to 4 million years old. And so these are the oldest walking upright fossils that we have. Now the next oldest, the Australopithecines, continue to exist, and we have some more recent fossils from Australopithecines. But the next step is Homo habilis. And these people, and they can be distinguished from Australopithecines by the shape of the skull, resembling more human-like features. Still, however, prolonged facial features, smaller cranial cavity. But these people date back to 1 to 4 million years ago. And then Homo erectus, more recent, but then we belong to the subspecies Homo sapien. And this is the most recent in terms of human evolutionary development. Now, among Homo sapiens, I guess living alongside them, were another species called Neanderthals. But the Homo sapiens eventually overtook the Neanderthals. And while there are still people with features resembling some of these ancient humans, Homo sapiens today are the only remaining human species. The others died out. Homo sapiens with the largest cranial cavity, us, are the ones who endured. And now, of these nomadic peoples, what did they do? How did they survive? These peoples were hunter-gatherers for eons, untold amounts of years. And we don't know a lot of specific details about their way of life because they left behind no written evidence. We have artifacts from these people. We have fossils from these people, but no writing. And that is because these people traveled constantly and were always in search of food. And so their day-to-day lives consisted of digging up plants, gathering roots and nuts and berries and edible food for consumption, making basic tools. This would have been called the Paleolithic era or the Old Stone Age. And then finally, finding safe places to rest. We often refer to these people as cavemen because they would live in whatever shelter they could find. And they never had permanent dwellings because they would always be moving from place to place as food availability would change. Now, it is during this time, during the Paleolithic era, that fire was discovered and that basic tools were discovered. And the reason we know this is because we have found evidence of human-made fire, and we have found some of these tools next to burial sites of these most ancient peoples. Now, again, in terms of cultural activities, we know very little beyond what we can infer from the limited evidence. But we have found some paintings, particularly in caves. For example, the caves in France that have been discovered that contain paintings that are over 40,000 years old. Maybe you've seen pictures of some of these cave paintings of animals or of people. 40,000 years old. Those are the oldest human artistic creations known to man. Now, from 10,000 BCE forward, we know a little more, because it was during this time that farming was discovered. And we call it the Neolithic Revolution. In fact, farming is distinguished from the time before farming as an entirely new portion of history. The reason being is that it changed life forever. Now, it doesn't mean that everyone stopped hunting and gathering and began farming. In fact, there are modern-day hunter-gatherers, and there are present-day nomadic peoples. Now, the first farming settlements were in the Middle East, in a place called the Fertile Crescent. In fact, the oldest farming settlement, and if you're a fan of the Old Testament, you may be familiar with this, the oldest settlement is between two rivers called the Tigris and Euphrates. Does anybody know what their significance is in the Old Testament? The Tigris and Euphrates. It's where the Garden of Eden was in the first chapter of Genesis, between these two rivers. And perhaps the significance there is that it was the site of the oldest farming settlement in Mesopotamia, which literally means the land between the rivers. Now, again, the Middle East has the distinction of containing the oldest farming settlements, but Mesoamerica and India also contain ancient farming settlements dating back to about 7,000 or 5,000 BCE, respectively. But also you see that there are ancient settlements throughout the world. And this occurred in a non-linear fashion, meaning that people didn't just set up in Mesopotamia and go, well, this sounds nice. Hey, I'm going to go check out India. It just occurred as people would migrate and would find suitable places to live. And I'd like to look briefly at this map. And so what we're looking at here is, again, a migration map, but this one has a little more detail. And you see that around 5000 BCE, these highlighted areas represent the only permanently settled areas in the world that we know of. So in 5000 BCE, there weren't a lot of people on this planet. And those few who did not live in settled communities wandered the vast expanses of the earth trying to survive. And then as we go forward, you see more and more settlements. Until finally, by the year 0, not fully populated, but more so than previous. But I wanted to show you an example. This is the oldest cave painting known to man. It was discovered in some caves in France. And what I think is neat here is what we can learn from this oldest image is of domesticated animals. I don't know if you're an animal lover like I am, but I think it's cool that the oldest image we made is of domesticated animals. Now, taming wild animals would have served a practical purpose. Dogs can help in search of food. Horses can obviously help with plowing, even in farming communities. And, of course, the search for food, or even in farming communities, the production of food would have been not only a daily effort, but a daily cause of concern. Famines were not uncommon in the ancient world. But domesticated animals included, according to the picture even, horses, dogs, goats, and even pigs. In fact, to own a large number of pigs in the ancient world was a... Now, people eventually evolved. Civilization evolved. People settled down from their nomadic lifestyles. and began to dwell in villages. And this served a practical purpose as well. Nomads tended to travel in small groups, typically united by family relationships. And so they traveled in clans of small family groups for survival and for safety. And farming settlements operated in the same way, because farming provided the opportunity to produce much more food than hunting or gathering. And so nomadic peoples would commonly raid farming settlements and steal food and livestock. And so these settlements would group together for protection. We also know from these farming settlements, in fact, the earliest form of writing is called cuneiform, dating back to Mesopotamia, these earliest Sumerian civilizations. We know that these civilizations were patriarchal, meaning male dominant. Now, as these farming communities became more sustainable, eventually they were able to produce a surplus of food. And this means that not everyone has to farm to survive. In fact, more people can engage in other activities, and this allows for specialization. For example, if half of your people are farmers, the other half could focus on crafts like metalworking, weaving, basket making, government, or even defense. And with this ability to specialize, instead of having to focus daily on survival, allows for technological development. But it's also with the Neolithic Revolution that mankind began to have a profound impact on the environment. Because the earliest form of farming is called slash and burn farming. If you go into an area with a high degree of rainfall, it's heavily forested. Well, the easiest way to clear the forest, if you were around this fall, is to set it on fire and to burn it to the ground. The woods burn, the trees fall, clear all of that, and you start a farm. It's much easier than cutting these trees by hand. It's much faster. And that's called slash and burn farming. And that's the most ancient form of clearing land. Sadly, slash and burn farming is still used in some parts of the world today. So, one of your essay questions this week is going to focus on characteristics of civilization. And so if that's something you'd like to write about, maybe you'll find this information useful. So, with farming comes sophistication. And what do we mean when we talk about this sophistication? What do we mean when we talk about the advancement of civilization? Well, number one, an urban focus. That means more people living in community. Political and military structure. That means organization, governance, and defense. Anytime you have more than one person in a group, there need to be guidelines about how to behave within that group. You know, for example, thank you for wearing clothing. It's a societal norm that we clothe ourselves. It wasn't always written down, it's just an expectation. But again, this would be a part of civilization. And then new social structure based on economic power. You know, the pyramidal structure of society with the wealthy at the top and the many at the bottom. That is a basic element of civilization, is that there is a structure to society. And then finally, development of more complexity in a material sense. For example, the hunter-gatherer might have had a few handful of tools they could have carried. It's amazing to think that life went on for eons that way. And they might have been able to carry a day or two's worth of food. But that would have been the extent of their material wealth. However, a farmer living in a village could acquire a reasonable amount of wealth and property and family, etc. Next, in civilization, we see a distinct religious structure. And what I mean by there is that when we get people living together in settled communities, and this specialization of labor, eventually people develop systems for writing and keeping records. And these records contain stories of the myths of their religious beliefs. And then finally, new and significant artistic and intellectual activity. That people actually have leisure time to devote to self-betterment and to enjoyment. Now, these river valley civilizations were always around rivers, hence the name river valley civilizations. And the oldest ones include the river valleys of the Tigris and the Euphrates, like I mentioned before. The Nile River, I'm sure you've heard of Egypt and its importance in the ancient world. These two areas led to the civilizations of Mesopotamia, again meaning land between the rivers, and the civilization of Egypt. But these weren't the only two places where civilization developed. We also have the Indus River Valley, which of course is now today the country of India. The Indus River goes from the mountains in the Himalayas, where it starts, and then flows all the way down to the Arabian Sea. But also some of the most ancient civilizations developed in China around the Yellow River and in other places like Central Asia and Peru. But another question we have to ask ourselves is, why did civilization develop? What is the inherent value, if you will? Well, number one, there was a challenge. There was a need for civilization. And that basic need came from surviving. That grouped together, we can do more than we can individually. And with civilization, as I said previously, came political and military and social structures. But again, we have to ask ourselves, what was the purpose originally of religion? What did that serve? And we also have to think about how little these ancient people knew about the world around them. For example, even Aristotle, the Greek philosopher, thought there were only 4 basic elements. Our periodic table has far more than 4. And so that we knew so little about the world around us. And so much of it was ascribed to mystery. Mystery can lead to superstition, to myth. And finally, that big yellow ball in the sky, which features so prominently in our daily lives, becomes Ra, the sun god. And so for a moment, I'm going to focus on the ancient Near East, really at a place called the Fertile Crescent. And so, here you see the Red Sea, much more zoomed in than what we were looking at before class. So we're going to be particularly talking about the region of Palestine and the area of Mesopotamia around Tigris and Euphrates. So this is really the modern-day Iraq, Israel, Lebanon, Syria, etc. And we'll start with Mesopotamia. The most ancient city-states were populated by a people called the Sumerians. And these city-states were in a region called Mesopotamia. Now these cities, I'm using the word city-state because each city served as an independent political unit. Because the logic is, group together with your neighbors for safety and don't trust anyone else. Because resources are so limited, and conflict comes from limited resources. I hope I don't live long enough to see conflict over water. But I fear that this may happen in our lifetimes as population continues to grow. You see, these cities were surrounded by walls and defensive towers, which could protect the people. And then the farmland would be in the surrounding countryside. And so the logic was the nomads and invaders come to attack, they destroy and loot the farm and take whatever is growing, but the people are safe inside. At the center of each of these cities is a temple. They're shaped in the form of a pyramid. These are called ziggurats. Each of these cities had their own local god, be it Asher or Beelzebub or Yahweh. Each of these peoples had their own god. And with that, they formed an identity. Leadership often originated in two different sources. In some of your more warlike states, the king was the strongest, the most powerful, who could dominate his people. In some of the more advanced societies, you often had a theocracy, where the king might be someone who claimed communion with the gods. So if the big yellow sun is the most powerful god you can think of, if someone claims to be able to communicate with the sun and explain why it didn't come out today and why it's not going to help me grow my crops today, I'm going to listen to that person. Because if they can make the sun come out, I need that to survive. And so often kingship was divine in origin. Economies were primarily agricultural, though trade and commerce did exist even in the ancient world. There were basic social groups in the ancient world: the nobility, the common folk, and yes, slavery is an ancient institution. And next I wanted to zoom in to the most ancient city that we know of. This is a modern aerial photograph of the city-state of Ur. Located in the center of the city is the temple. And this is what the temple looks like today. It is in ruins. But if you look at what the original structure might have looked like, they've recreated what they think it looked like, you see this ziggurat shape. So at the very top, the priest would claim to commune with whatever gods this city worshipped and would bring down to the people the will of the gods. Now this city also, and we've dug these places up, not me personally, but others have, contained a royal cemetery where the kings and queens would be buried. It contained a high priestess where a woman of great religious authority lived. You can even see the remnants of the surrounding wall that protected these people. But then here is where the actual temple, what we're looking at here, stood. Now, as I said, conflict, just like today, often originated from limited resources, particularly farmable land and water. Now, the first conqueror, the first person to build an empire or attempt to unite these city-states was a person named Sargon, who established the first empire, conquered even Mesopotamia, these walled city-states we were just looking at. Now, when his empire fell, just 200 years after his life, the city-states returned to their divided, independent ways. This area was finally reunited in 1792 BCE. And by the way, we know this because these people have left behind forms of writing. For example, the Sumerians left the earliest forms of writing that we know of, and it's called cuneiform, and we can't actually read it and decipher it. And so we know the story of Sargon, and we know approximately when his empire fell, and we know that the Babylonians reunited the area under a king named Hammurabi, who established the new capital at Babylon, which is the modern-day city of Baghdad. Now, Hammurabi imposed a very strict system of rules. And by the way, one of your forum topics for this week is all about the Code of Hammurabi. So if that's something you'd like to read about and write about for your forum post, this may be relevant. In Hammurabi's code, he established strict justice, harsh justice. In fact, it was Hammurabi who first said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. And then later that was put into the book of Leviticus. Penalties were doled out according to class. This is not 14th Amendment equality under the law type of stuff. This is if you were a Babylonian free male and you committed a crime, you were treated differently than if you were a female and committed a crime, or if you were a slave and committed a crime. It also laid out rules for marriage and the family, and even regulations of social and sexual interactions. This ancient Babylon is famous for one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. This is a depiction of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. But next, a little about the culture of Mesopotamia. This region is often prone to natural disaster. Rivers can dry up in this arid region. Famine can lead to desperation and starvation. And with no understanding of meteorology and no understanding of geology or seasons, aside from a basic primitive understanding, these phenomena were ascribed to acts of God, or gods, usually, because most of these people were polytheistic. In fact, Mesopotamia alone contained around 3,000 gods and goddesses. The most prominent I'd like to introduce you to are the god of the sky, the god of the wind, of earth, and finally the mother, among 3,000 others. But these were the most prominent. But again, it was during this time that writing was developed. The oldest form we know of is cuneiform, translated meaning wedge-shaped. Because when you look at it, I think I've got a picture to show you. It literally looks like chicken scratch. It's difficult to decipher if you're not a linguist. And the purpose of this was to keep records, to communicate ideas. Much of it, in fact, is rather boring ledgers of business transactions. It's not that exciting, right? The oldest form of writing are largely spreadsheets. Oh yeah, they'll always be around. However, some of it is fascinating. The oldest story dates back to the Sumerians. It's called the Epic of Gilgamesh. It tells of a man who challenges a mighty king with superpowers, wrestles the king to a standstill, and the two respect each other's power and become friends. It's a neat story of competition and heroism and a little bit of superhero stuff, but also a good moral to the story. Again, that's the oldest story in the world. Look up Epic of Gilgamesh if you want to read more about it. The Sumerians also developed a system of mathematics and astronomy, a basic number system. They also began to chart the heavenly constellations. Some you can decipher with the naked eye. You know, even without my glasses, I can see the Big and Little Dipper. I can see Orion and Orion's belt. And they even came up with a calendar based on the 12 lunar months, plus an extra month, because they didn't quite understand the fact that we have 365.25 days each year. And so next, let's jump over to Egypt. When you talk about Egypt, the Nile River dominates the conversation. Egypt became a prosperous region because the lower Nile, in the northern part of Egypt near the Mediterranean Sea, fans out into a delta. And that delta, where the river becomes many different rivers before it reaches the sea, is an extremely fertile region in the midst of a great desert. And that makes the Egyptians rather wealthy for their time. The river would flood every year in a rather predictable fashion. And that served not only as their source of fresh water, but it would also, each time it would flood, it would wash down rich silt or soil, which would be good for farming. This led to abundant harvests. In fact, in the Old Testament, when it talks about Abraham's grandson, Jacob, who had 12 sons who were living in a region near Egypt, were starving because there was a great famine in the land. Because these rivers, typically, they would dry up or whatnot. And as the story goes, Joseph had been sold into slavery and then invited his brothers to come to Egypt to live. And that's the legend of how the Jews came to Egypt in antiquity. Now, Egypt doesn't have everything. In fact, Egypt had a lot of things going against it. They had no natural barriers for defense. They are a bridgeway between three continents: Europe, Asia, and Africa. People are always passing through this rich and fertile land. And so, as such, the Egyptians are always getting conquered by different peoples. It becomes difficult to keep up with who they've been conquered by lately. But in Egyptian civilization, the importance of religion is essential to understanding the Egyptian culture. Egyptians were certainly polytheistic, again meaning they believed in many gods. Of prominence were the sun gods and the land gods. The Egyptian rulers were called the son of Ra, Ra being the god of the sun. And these rulers were considered his offspring. So leadership was meant to be divine in origin. That's convenient, right? If God made you boss, then supposedly no human would have the right to take that power from you. Now I'm going to briefly go over the course of Egyptian history, and I'm going to summarize here for time's sake. There was an age of prosperity and splendor. People worshipped the pharaohs as divine. Great tombs were built for these pharaohs, meant to be symbols of their power, but also vehicles to transport them to the afterlife. Tombs to contain their wealth for when they were resurrected. In fact, I wanted to show you the inside of one of these tombs. This is King Tut, the famous boy king. He was 8 years old when he died. He has been well preserved. In fact, he's a better world traveler than I am because he hops from museum to museum. I saw him most recently in Chicago. Inside his tomb are these many different treasures. The drawings on this wall may be symbols of the Egyptian moon god, but also next to him were cases like this to hold his organs. Now, of course, he was a boy. He might have even had models or toys. But these toys also had a religious significance. For example, this boat was believed to have helped him travel into the new life. And this sarcophagus was so well made that when it was opened, his face was largely preserved. But as soon as it hit the air, it began to decompose. So can you imagine a tomb built thousands of years ago that was airtight? And we can't even build a phone case that's airtight anymore. Well, a little further in Egyptian history, a time known as the Middle Kingdom. This is the real golden age. A time of stability and trade. A time of expansion when the Egyptians actually went on to conquer whole different countries such as Nubia, or adding in new regions like Palestine and Syria. The Pharaoh's main concern during this period of history known as the Middle Kingdom was to build great public works, to give his people jobs, but also to glorify himself. And his main concerns were to provide for the welfare of his people. But in the next period of Egyptian history we call the New Kingdom, which began with Queen Hatshepsut, who oversaw much of this material prosperity. And then Amenhotep, then of course King Tut, and Ramesses. And these people presided over the time known as the New Kingdom. And so some significant events that occurred during this time. Number one, the empire came to an end around this time. It was eventually dominated by other groups of people. And that's the general story of Egypt. Since they lived between three major continents, they were always being conquered. In fact, they eventually became a province of the Greeks when Alexander the Great conquered them, and then finally a province of Rome when Alexander's empire disintegrated and then was reconquered by the Romans. Now a little about the culture and daily life of ancient Egypt. There was a hierarchical structure to life. In fact, society looked just like the tombs of the pharaohs. It was a pyramid. The pharaoh was at the very top of the pyramid. But next you have priests, and then you have nobles, and there was a middle class of merchants and skilled workers. But most people were commoners, often in many cases bound to the land they lived on, which was often owned by nobles, whom they had to pay taxes to. So if you will, most people rented. And they paid taxes to these kings and nobles in the form of the crops that they produced. And they could be conscripted into military service or forced into public works labor for building projects. Now, art served a spiritual purpose as well as a functional one. Their form of writing is often in the form of drawing or hieroglyphs, and these are sacred writings, often on papyrus, the oldest form of paper, made from reeds. And though they never had a developed alphabet, these symbols conveyed ideas and can now be interpreted and deciphered and contain the history of the Egyptians according to their scribes. But as I said previously, nomadic peoples did not cease to exist. In fact, as these river civilizations were developing, nomadic peoples still continued to travel the world in search of food and resources and then taking what they could from others. And one group of these people were the Indo-Europeans. They spread to Europe, to India, to northwestern Asia. In fact, we are, if you are Caucasian, you are a descendant of Indo-Europeans, these nomadic peoples who populated the earth and traveled much longer even than many of these river civilizations. Some of these wound up settling in Asia Minor, some around Turkey, some formed the kingdom of the Hittites. In fact, many of these people, these nomadic peoples, developed some of the most ancient advanced weaponry. It was in fact the Hittites who first used iron weapons. Another group, the Hyksos, who conquered the Egyptians, first used the chariots. And these people were constantly at war with one another because resources were so limited. In fact, the Hittites, even though they were the first to develop iron tools, were eventually destroyed by other Indo-European groups. The next group I'd like to talk about briefly is a group known as the Phoenicians. These were a Semitic-speaking people who lived in the region of Palestine. They were known as sea traders and colonizers. In fact, they were the ones who developed the first primitive alphabet. Another group, the Jews, commonly referred to as the, quote, children of Israel, because of the legend that Abraham, their patriarch, made a covenant with their God that they would be the children of Yahweh and that he would be their protector. The Jewish people were the first monotheist, meaning those who believed in only one God. And their religion, named after the most prominent of the 12 tribes, is called Judaism, after the tribe of Judah. They would have a heavy influence on Christianity as well as Islam. And they became a distinctive people, even still today, dating back to 1200 BCE. But they would eventually develop a nation over time until it was conquered by the Babylonians around 350 BCE. But they were known as the Israelites. Just wanted to look at 3 systems of writing here and trace the evolution briefly with you. The Phoenicians here, I like to look at the letter A because it's the simplest to interpret and it's at the top. The Phoenicians had a basic form of the letter A, which, by the way, a little fun fact about the letter A. If you turn it upside down, it looks like a cow. In fact, that's how some believe it originated, was the mark of how many animals were inscribed on a tree or a fence post on someone's property. But anyway, and then the Greeks developed it to a more modern form, almost recognizable, and then, of course, modern English.
You said it looked like a what? A cow?
Okay, so into Palestine and into the first millennium BCE. Let's talk about the Jews just briefly. This is a painting of Abraham, patriarch of the Jewish people. And this is him moving his family on these herds from the city-state of Ur to the land of Canaan, where they lived around what is Israel today until they went to Egypt. Now, the kingdom of Israel was for a very brief time in terms of history, several lifetimes, if you will. Was originally united under King Saul, who perished in battle, who passed on his power to a young boy, King David, who, when he perished, passed on his power to King Solomon. And really, where Solomon is where the story begins. Because under Solomon, the Israelites saw their peak of prosperity. For a brief time, they controlled all the land of Palestine, with Jerusalem as their capital. Solomon built the temple of God, where the Ark of the Covenant was supposedly stored until it was lost. Yeah, the Ark from Raiders of the Lost Ark, like the Ark, was in this temple. But when Solomon died, even as small a kingdom as we're talking about, I mean roughly the size of Western Carolina, folks, still broke up. Broke up into different parts. The kingdom of Israel in the north, and the land of Judah in the south. But eventually all of these peoples would be defeated by the Assyrians, the most warlike and bloodthirsty of the ancient peoples. The Hebrews were captured at this time, were deported from their own land. And only 2 of the tribes remained for a period of time to resist. But eventually the Assyrians were defeated by the Chaldeans, later known as the Babylonians, but who also went in and destroyed the city of Jerusalem along with the temple. And that's the last we saw of the Ark of the Covenant. So no more 10 Commandments, no more Ark of the Covenant, all of that good stuff. Until later, the Chaldeans were conquered by the Persians under King Darius, who was known as a much more tolerant ruler, and in fact allowed the Jews to return to their homeland, allowed Nehemiah to rebuild the temple, and they were allowed to do their own thing effectively until they were conquered by Alexander the Great. You know, it's the disadvantage of living between 3 continents in a fertile soil area. Everyone else wants what you got. And so these people were frequently conquered. Here's an ancient depiction of the Temple of Jerusalem under the time of Solomon. A little about this religion. These people were monotheistic. They worshipped a God named Yahweh. This is the God of the Jews. The same God, if you're a Christian, would be Yahweh. Now, this God is believed to be omnipotent and just and good, and expected the same of his people, except for the omnipotence, but expected obedience, or he would punish his people. And the Old Testament is full of really nasty stories where God would punish his people. In the book of Exodus, he makes them drink gold and die from it. He curses them with plagues, just punishes them really nasty ways from time to time. Now, there are three aspects of the Jewish religion in antiquity. There's the covenant, the promise that God made to Abraham, that the Jews believe they still live under this covenant, this promise of, obey me and I will be your God and you'll be my people. There is the law. In fact, it's known as the Torah, the books of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And then there are the prophets. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, Daniel, Hosea, Joel, Amos, so on and so forth. And these prophets interpreted, or claimed to have interpreted, the will of God. And then there's Charlton Heston, right? If you know the old movie. Okay. Ten Commandments. Notice he's been doing his tricep workout. Yeah, I just thought that picture was awesome. And this is the Torah, as it actually looks today. This is a very old copy. In fact, this copy is on parchment, and it would be rolled out in a scroll. And so this copy of the first 5 books of the Bible is very old, and it would be used in a synagogue today. And again, it tells the story of Abraham and his descendants and how they would be faithful and how they sometimes screwed up. I mean, Abraham, for example, told the Pharaoh, hey, you can sleep with my wife. And apparently he was punished for that. But then, there's all kinds of just interesting stories. They just continue to do stupid things and they get punished or whatever, or a plague. Yeah. I wish I had more time to tell you about the Assyrians, but briefly, these are the most warlike people. These were the Dark Empire, the evil ones, if you will. They were great conquerors. They developed a well-organized military machine. They had a very large army that was well-organized with chariots and iron weapons, that modern technology. They could take down walled cities with mast ladders or sappers digging tunnels under walls. They also often laid siege to cities and starved them out. And they used terrorism to often cause cities to surrender without a fight. They built up a large empire, including Mesopotamia, parts of Iran, Asia Minor, Syria, Palestine, and of course even Egypt. Those poor guys, always getting conquered. And the Assyrians built a mighty empire. But nothing compared to the Persian Empire. Because you see, the unfortunate reality is that if you're going to be this bad a people, you're going to make people very upset. In fact, eventually, the Medes and the Persians rebelled against the Assyrian Empire and overthrew them. Well, because, they were pretty nasty people. This is an inscription from a very ancient drawing of the Assyrian people, how they would pile up the heads to count the dead. They would force the slaves, who were their conquered enemies, to grind up the bodies of the defeated. I don't know, for consumption or what. Here's a relief or a carving in stone of one of the famous kings of the Assyrians, Ashurbanipal, killing a lion with a spear. This would be a handy piece of propaganda. If you're going to rule the most warlike and bloodthirsty people on earth, you better be a badass yourself, just so. And briefly, this just depicts aspects of war. You see the ladders here they could use. You see the tunnelers they could use, shields they had developed which could resist arrows, and all kinds of nasty things. As I said, these people fell to the Persians. Under Cyrus the Great, who became king of the Persian Empire, was known for his wisdom and compassion and had a reputation for mercy. In fact, he was the one who allowed the Jews to return to their home and rebuild the temple. He said, believe whatever you want to believe. That's not my concern. In fact, under one of his later successors, Darius, the Persian Empire became the largest of its time, developed an effective system of government, a unified people, even had an interstate highway system called the Royal Road. But of course, I just wanted to remind you these people did come to power through conquest, as you see here. But yet, once they conquered, they had a reputation for tolerance and peace, as you can see from this picture. This is an example of cuneiform. In fact, this inscription contains the Code of Hammurabi, the oldest form of law. But I wanted to talk briefly about how the empire was divided. You see, the Emperor Cyrus established an effective system of government. 20 different provinces, each ruled by a governor called a satrap. And each of these governors effectively governed their state as an independent political unit. Each of these governors would collect the taxes from their people and would distribute their share to the central government, would command and raise armies, if necessary, for the defense of the empire. But each of these provinces were united by this royal road. And all people, no matter which province you belonged to, were considered subjects of the Persian Empire. The empire itself had a standing professional army of units organized by 10,000. Again, here's an inscription of one of these Persian kings. Unlike Ashurbanipal killing a lion with a spear, this man is seen in a much more kindly and beneficent stature. And I wanted to show you an example of a Persian gold coin. In fact, this has Cyrus's image inscribed on it, dating back from the 5th century BC. And speaking of tolerance, under a tolerant ruler, you have new ideas. And one of these new ideas was Zoroastrianism. Zoroastrianism is a belief that life consists of a cosmic struggle between good and evil, and that humans are given free will and the power to choose between right and wrong. And guess what? That a soul is judged by a single monotheistic God according to their deeds in life. In fact, Zoroastrianism, the prophet, lived in 660 BC. Judaism was formalized by the Torah's written form in 350 BC. This guy heavily influenced Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. So, for example, where did the concept of good and evil come from? Ask Zoroaster. Where did the concept of monotheism come from? Was it these oral traditions that were eventually formalized during the Babylonian captivity in 350 BC? Or was it the predecessor, Zoroaster? How about the concept of the judgment in an afterlife? Does that originally come from the book of Revelation, written in AD 90? Or would it have originated here in 660 BCE? There's a picture of Zoroaster strutting his stuff.